Welcome to the fourth season of Murder in 20 podcast, where I, Bobby Stevens, am your host with a new episode every Wednesday. If you're a serious fan of true crime and love listening to podcasts but don't want all that small talk, you've come to the right place. We get right to the facts. Murder in 20 episodes are concise and complete in 20 minutes. Less talk and more true crime. Be sure to like, share, and follow us to learn about upcoming episodes every Wednesday. Thanks for tuning in. Now let's get to this week's episode. Joseph Sutherland's family lived off the land in Fort Albany First Nation, a small town on the banks of the Albany River that feeds into Hudson's Bay, an area steeped in rich First Nations history. His father died when he was young, and his mother sent him and his two older brothers to St. Anne's Residential School, a school known for its harrowing abuse against Indigenous children. After a few years, he left St. Anne's and went to live with his mother and sister in Moosonee. Court records reported that by age 14, Joseph had started drinking, and after grade 8, dropped out of high school. In his late teens, he moved in with his mother and sister in Toronto, but things didn't go well, and he returned to Fort Albany. Then in 1983, Joseph returned to Toronto, where he lived alone in a bachelor apartment. Joseph had grown into a handsome man with short dark hair that hung in wisps on his forehead. His dark eyes danced when he broke into a big smile. Now 21, he struggled with alcohol. Susan had just moved back to Toronto. Years earlier, she met Anne Chisholm at camp, and the two became lifelong best friends. Growing up, Susan's father was a doctor, and she followed his footsteps into the medical field, graduating in nursing at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. That's where she met Fred Tice. The couple wed in the spring of 1961. The bride chose a simple off-the-shoulder white dress that showcased her neckline, accessorized with a delicate string of pearls. The groom wore a dark suit with the white carnation on his left lapel. The couple beamed brightly. They had their whole lives ahead of them. A life that included 4 happy children, daughter Christian and 3 sons, Ben, John, and Jason. Susan continued to further her education, and in 1980 received a master's degree in social work. Susan and Fred were successful in their careers. Susan and the family followed Fred as he climbed the corporate ladder and moved from city to city. Eventually, Fred would become the vice president of a major investment firm. In the early 1980s, the family found themselves leaving Toronto and moving to Calgary. Susan was energetic and had many good friends who were sad to see her leave. But then, after 20 years, times had changed, and the couple decided to go their separate ways, something they hadn't shared with their friends yet. When Fred was transferred back to Toronto in 1983, Susan and the family followed. Fred moved into a townhouse, while Susan purchased a house for her and the children. Also living in Toronto was David Gilmour, the son of an investment banker. David was an entrepreneur and became successful with many businesses, including furniture, a hotel chain, and was co-founder of Fiji Water. David and his wife Anna divorced while their only child, a daughter named Erin, was young. Anna remarried and had 2 sons. Erin was thrilled with her younger brothers, Sean and Kaylin. Although Erin grew up surrounded by wealth and attended the best schools, she remained grounded and happy. She was thoughtful, gentle, and outgoing. When she walked into a room, everyone was instantly drawn to her. She was intelligent and did well in school, and had many interests, including the arts, writing, and fashion design. After high school, she attended fashion school while working at a high-end boutique. In August, Joseph and Susan's paths would cross in the most unlikely way. Susan had plans for the upcoming Monday to attend a family gathering. On Sunday night, her daughter Christian was away at camp, and she was home all alone. Sometime after midnight, Joseph broke into Susan's house. He attacked her, hitting her over the head with a liquor bottle. Susan screamed. A neighbor heard her, but didn't call police. Joseph sexually assaulted her, then attacked her with a knife. She fought back. Joseph continued to stab her in the chest. Susan tried to defend herself, but after 13 stab wounds, her life was taken from her. Susan died at 45. 15 minutes later, the neighbor heard footsteps between their houses, but did not call police. The next day, when Susan didn't attend her family event, and her brother-in-law couldn't reach her by phone, he stopped by the house to check on her. It was almost 1 p.m., and he noticed the mail was still in her mailbox. He went around to the back door and found it open. He wandered through the first floor, then headed upstairs, and just as he entered Susan's bedroom, he heard the phone ringing and stopped to answer it. As he reached for the phone, he turned, and that's when he saw Susan and called police. During their investigation, investigators focused on her ex-husband, as is often the case, but he was cleared. Susan's house was emptied in preparation to sell it. But before it sold, her daughter Christian would take the bus and let herself in with her key. For hours, she walked through the house and tried to wrap her head around how it happened. Then, in the fall, Erin decided it was time to spread her wings. Her aunt told the Toronto Star that she was 22 and it was time to leave the nest. An apartment had come up for rent right above the store where she worked, and nearby was her aunt's furniture store. It was a perfect location for her first apartment. She could walk to work, and with family nearby, she felt safe. At the end of November, Erin met with the fashion writer and editor. He'd arranged for her to work for her as a freelance fashion coordinator beginning in the new year. Erin was excited. Her plans for the future were coming together. Erin looked a lot like her mother, but while her mother's hair was long and dark, Erin's had streaks of blonde. Her cheeks bubbled as she smiled, and people felt comfortable around her. But Erin also received unwanted attention in the form of obscene and threatening phone calls. Her number was unlisted, and she had no idea how they'd gotten her number or who was calling her. A few weeks before Christmas, Erin was relieved to get away and spent 10 days in Aspen, Colorado, skiing with family members. Returning home, it was 4 days before Christmas, and Erin's 2 younger brothers spent the night at her apartment. The 3 spent the evening huddled in her bed, munching on popcorn and watching movies. The next morning, Erin drove her brothers back to their mother's house before going to work. Just before 6 p.m., Erin's coworker said goodbye and handed Erin the keys so she could close up at 9 p.m. Erin had plans that evening to attend a cocktail party with Anthony, a longtime friend. But he was running late, so after work, Erin headed upstairs to her apartment to wait for him. Joseph had broken into her apartment. He gagged Erin, tied her up, and placed her on the bed, then sexually assaulted her, before stabbing her in the chest. The blade penetrated her heart. Erin died at 22. Joseph threw a comforter over her, then fled. At 9:20, Anthony arrived at Erin's. The door was open. He pushed it further and discovered his friend. Police went door to door in the neighborhood, but investigators never connected the dots between Susan and Erin's murders. No leads ever pointed towards Joseph, and he continued on with his life. By 1988, he'd stopped drinking, went to school, and took computer programming. It had been 5 years since he'd killed 2 women, and the past was haunting him. He embarked on a spirit quest, where he reached out to Susan and Erin's spirits and asked for their forgiveness. Afterwards, he vowed to be a good person. In 1995, Joseph married and had a son. That same year, he got a job working for a bank. 5 years later, he and his wife divorced. In 2007, he was laid off at the bank and moved back to Moosonee. Through the years, he met and befriended Randy Coda, an officer with the Ontario Provincial Police. Randy and his wife knew Joseph as an upstanding citizen. And even though he was in law enforcement for years, Randy's instincts never kicked in. He never suspected Randy had such an evil past. Then in 2020, the Toronto Cold Case Unit received a grant to utilize genetic genealogy. The science of DNA had evolved greatly over the last 37 years. DNA collected at both Susan and Erin's crime scenes were sent for testing. And when the results came back, investigators were in for a big surprise. The same person was responsible for both their murders. But there was no match in the databank. However, genealogy researchers were able to identify the DNA going all the way back to Joseph's great-grandparents. It was only a matter of time. In a public video, Constable Andrew Doyle, a member of Toronto's Cold Case Unit, directed a message to Joseph where he said in part, "I say, turn yourself in. I'm speaking directly to you. Erin Gilmour's family deserve answers. They deserve justice. Susan Tice's family deserve justice." Using investigative genetic genealogy research, they were able to trace the DNA through public genealogy websites. The noose was tightening. It was narrowed down to the 5 Sutherland brothers. Police were able to clear 4 of the brothers, and that left Joseph. They tried to covertly get a DNA sample from Joseph, but were unsuccessful. So they approached a judge and were able to convince them that it was reasonable to believe Joseph was a killer, but they needed his DNA to prove it. On November 24, 2022, officers arrived at Joseph's home in Moosonee with a warrant to obtain a blood sample. Now 61, and after all these years, he knew why they were there. Dateline's episode of Evil Walked Through the Door reported that after police left, Joseph called his longtime friend Randy, now retired from law enforcement, and insisted he come over. Randy knew it was almost time for his wife to pick up their children and she needed the truck. But Joseph was one of his best friends, and he couldn't say no. Arriving at Joseph's, the two men sat at the table, and Joseph confessed. Randy was in shock, and at the same time wondered how he'd never suspected anything. Randy told him it was time to own up to what he'd done. The families deserved answers. Keeping an eye on the time, Randy raced back to his house so his wife could pick up their children. Then Randy contacted the police and told them about Joseph's confession. They knew they had to apprehend him quickly. Randy talked them into holding off on any big maneuvers and said that he could convince Joseph to turn himself in. A few hours later, Randy returned to Joseph's house while police parked just out of sight and waited. Randy and Joseph sat back down at the table, and he told Joseph he had to turn himself in. After 39 years, it was time. Joseph and Randy walked out to the waiting police cruiser. The next day, police flew Joseph to Toronto, where he was held without bail. Susan and Erin's families were notified. They were relieved that after all these years, their loved one's murderer would be brought to justice. Erin's younger brother Sean said that it was a day he and his family had been waiting almost an entire lifetime for, and that it finally put a name and a face to someone who for all of them had been a ghost. Christian was home when she received the news of Joseph's arrest. She went over to a photo of her mom and fist-pumped it, telling her, "We finally got him for you." Then she picked up the phone and called her mother's best friend Anne, who said that even now she can still see her clear as day, Susan's crooked front tooth and her beautiful smile. Joseph claimed he had no recollection of Susan's murder and that he only vaguely remembered Erin's. However, investigators found that doubtful, particularly as he had sufficient memory to embark on a spirit quest 5 years after their murders. In October 2023, Joseph pled guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder. In March 2024, he was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 21 years. He will be eligible in 2043 when he will be 81 years old. Thanks for listening to Murder in 20 with less talk and more true crime. Be sure to tune in next Wednesday for the episode of Angelina Rodriguez. She loved the thought of being in love, but she never really loved the men she married. With 3 divorces behind her, she wasn't about to divorce her 4th. Rather, she planned to profit from his demise. If you're dying to hear more, past episodes of Murder in 20 are available for free at murderin20.com and on all major podcast platforms. We love what we do and are dying to continue. If you enjoy listening to Murder in 20 every week, we'd be eternally grateful for your support by visiting Murder in 20 at Patreon, PayPal, or murderin20.com. We'd like to acknowledge Purple Planet for use of their music, sound effects from Vaseline Studios and Quick Sounds, and our many editorial sources who are listed on our website. Be sure to like, share, and follow us to learn about upcoming episodes every Wednesday. Stay safe, sleep with the lights on, and don't play with strangers.